begin, it may be helpful to remind the House that the trial of Soldier F in relation to the events on Bloody Sunday is no longer sub judice, and that it is a focus of today's urgent question. There remain live cases in respect of other soldiers. I previously granted a waiver on the 14th of July 2025 to allow limited reference to active legal proceedings related to historic troubles-related deaths. However, references to live cases should be limited to the context and to the events which led to the cases, but not to the detail of cases themselves, nor the names of those individuals involved. I now call Alex Burkhardt, Shadow Secretary of State, for his urgent question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland if he will make a statement on the verdict in the trial of Soldier F.
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable member for his question. The trial of Soldier F concluded on the 23rd of October with a not guilty verdict. The Ministry of Defence rightly provided him with legal and pastoral support. I and the Secretary of State for Defence have of course noted the judgment, but I do not think it appropriate to be drawn on the particulars of these independent legal proceedings. The House will recognise that it was also a difficult day for the families of the 13 people shot dead on Bloody Sunday in circumstances that the former Prime Minister, Lord Cameron, described as, and I quote, unjustified and unjustifiable. I'm sure the sympathies of the whole House remain with them. We all understand the continuing pain felt by families and communities in Northern Ireland and across the United Kingdom as a result of the Troubles. And the Government remains committed to establishing a legacy process which can provide answers for families who are still seeking to find out what happened to their loved ones. We will also always remember the dangers faced by our brave soldiers, police and others who served during the time of Operation Banner and tried to keep people safe, while always remembering, especially at this time of year, the ultimate sacrifice made by those who gave their lives in doing so. Their service will never be forgotten, and we owe them a profound debt of gratitude. It is, however, Mr. Speaker, important to note that the Soldier F case, of course, involved no role for either this government or the last one. These were independent proceedings which were ongoing before the Legacy Act 2023, and they were not halted by that legislation. Mr. Speaker, decisions by the Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland are always taken independently in light of the individual facts and circumstances, and we should all respect that independence. A prosecution can only ever be brought when the evidence presents, in the view of prosecutors, a reasonable prospect of a conviction and where it is in the public interest to proceed. I also recognise that all those affected by the Troubles, including veterans, want a system that is fair, balanced and proportionate. That is what the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill is seeking to put in place, with a new Legacy Commission and strong protections for veterans which were not included in the last government's Legacy Act, which offered a false and undeliverable promise on immunity to our Northern Ireland veterans. These measures will provide what the 3 UK Veterans Commissioners have called for: not immunity from the law, but fairness under it.
Thank you for granting this urgent question, Mr. Speaker. I too want to begin with a thought for the families left bereft by the events of that day in 1972. It was a Conservative Prime Minister who 15 years ago said to this House, "What happened on Bloody Sunday was both unjustified and wrong. On behalf of our country, I'm deeply sorry." He did so, of course, after the publication of the Savile inquiry, which took 12 years and cost, in today's money, about £325 million. What is pertinent now is that even after such an extensive inquiry, there has been no conviction. Indeed, Judge Patrick Lynch told Belfast Crown Court that the evidence fell well short of the standard required. He said, "A 53-year-old statement cannot be cross-examined, nor can I assess the demeanour of a sheet of A4 paper. This goes to the heart of what my party argued when passing our Legacy Act.
Exactly. Well,
as time goes by, it becomes vanishingly difficult to obtain convictions. The 1998 agreement was 27 years ago, the ceasefires 31 years ago. And this, of course, has implications for the government's Troubles Bill, which will reopen many such cases, cases where there are no prospect of resolution, but only of ongoing legal process, with almost no possibility of bringing terrorists to court, but which ultimately leave open the likelihood of ever more vexatious complaints against our veterans. Claims like that thrown out by the High Court in Belfast last month, in which the judge described the challenge as utterly divorced from reality, but not before a former Special Forces soldier had to endure 4 years of investigation. Last week it was reported that a similar case from 53 years ago may soon go on trial. No wonder that on Friday SAS veterans had a letter in the Financial Times in which they said that legacy has become an industry that keeps wounds open while rewriting history. So we ask the Secretary of State to think again.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for that, and the fact that he referred to the Savile inquiry, because it was, of course, that long-running inquiry that finally brought, in the eyes of the families of the 13 people shot dead, some truth and some justice, in which led the former Prime Minister to make his apology. He is absolutely right when he says that with the passage of time, I think the phrase he used was, it is vanishingly difficult to obtain convictions, and most of the families, not all, but most of the families that I have met who lost loved ones recognise that fact. But he also has to acknowledge that the Legacy Act, with its offer of immunity in return for statements that the Legacy Commission regarded as truthful and credible, which could have given immunity to terrorists. And that is why the immunity that the last government sought to put in place was rejected by victims and survivors groups in Northern Ireland, was opposed by all of the political parties in Northern Ireland, and was found by the courts to be incompatible with our human rights obligations. And therefore, as I've said to the House before, and I've said to him, it was no basis for trying to help those families to find the answers that they are looking for. That is why we need a different approach, building, I grant him, on the establishment of the Legacy Commission, because I took the decision that we would not abolish it but reform it. That is what the bill that we will debate shortly seeks to do, and I look forward to it being scrutinised by the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Many people impacted by the Troubles continue to live with the pain, trauma and grief of war. Now, the previous government's approach to legacy was rendered essentially useless because, as the Secretary of State just said, it was opposed by all the political parties in Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Secretary of State what steps he's taken to carry all the people of Northern Ireland with him and his approach to legacy?
Secretary of State.
Well, having promised the House of Commons in two statements since the government was elected in July 2024 that I would bring forward proposals, I did so when the government published the bill on the 14th of October. Since then, I have met political parties, I have met victims and survivors organisations representing victims and survivors. I will be meeting the Victims and Survivors Forum that I met the day that the agreement with the Irish government was published. I will be meeting them again this week. I would say that, as I acknowledged to the House when I made my oral statement, any proposals that are put forward are not going to be greeted with approval by everyone. But I have been much struck by the fact that those I have met and talked to have said, well, we will need to consider the detail. I believe that it provides a basis for moving forward, and I hope the House will recognise that too.
Alpington Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for his responses so far. We welcome the resolution of this trial and the clarity that the law has afforded, and in doing so also extend our deepest sympathies to the families who still seek justice and answers. The 2023 Legacy Act may have been driven by the instinct to protect veterans. However, it failed to comply with our international legal obligations and, through its conditional immunity, created a false equivalence between those who valiantly served in the British Armed Forces and those involved in acts of terrorism. That approach was both morally wrong and offensive to veterans and victims alike. The violence carried out by terrorist organisations during the Troubles caused deep suffering across Northern Ireland, and we believe that upholding the rule of law must apply to all without exception, but that prosecution should never become persecution. This case focuses our attention back on the government's new deal, with a new attempt to deal with the legacy of the past. Is the Secretary of State absolutely confident that the bill will deliver strong enough protections for British veterans? What has he done to try and secure support from veterans' organisations? And what has he done to ensure that victims and families can finally access the truth and justice that they deserve?
Well, I agree with what the Honourable Gentleman said, the characterisation he made of the immunity provisions in the Legacy Act. I would quote to him what Nick Pope, the chair of the Confederation of Service Charities, said. He said, as the Confederation of Service Charities, we welcome, and I quote, the development of the safeguards that have been put in place to offer protection to those within the armed forces community who are affected by legacy issues. We drew them up having spoken to veterans, and I hope that when people look at them and see how they will work, they will recognise that we have acknowledged the particular responsibility we have to veterans to treat them fairly in the process, and that is the right way to proceed.
Trina Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 53 years after the events of Bloody Sunday, 15 years after the report of the Savile inquiry, it's becoming clear that the prospect of future criminal cases is few and far between. But those families who've lost loved ones, whether they be the families of military personnel, or those who were simply in the wrong families of those who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time on a particular day, sits with those people every single day and affects every day of their lives. What assurances can the Secretary of State give me that they remain part, absolutely at the centre of work going forward?
Well, those families, all those families, including military families, are at the centre of what we are seeking to do. What is the government trying to achieve? To create a legacy system which more people in Northern Ireland can have confidence in. The last Legacy Act failed to command sufficient confidence on the part of the people in Northern Ireland. That is a fact that no one can dispute. And we want to put in place arrangements that even where, and I agree with my honourable friend, prosecution is not possible, they are increasingly unlikely with the passage of time. I think the judgment in the case of Soldier F made that extremely clear in the judge's summing up. But to be able to provide information about what happened to those families.
Of the House, Edward Lee.
Well, whatever the wrongs committed on that day, does the Secretary of State understand that it just beggars belief that a former IRI man can be, in his old age, lolling on a sofa now, despite all his torturings, kneecappings, executions? I'm thinking of Captain Naurak, abducted, tortured, killed, his perpetrators never brought to justice. Does he realise that this whole process is deeply wounding to the morale of the British Army? He can take refuge in independent prosecution, but he can give his own opinion, and he can say, surely it's time now that Northern Ireland moved on into a better age.
Well, we all want Northern Ireland to be able to move on to a better age and a better future, but we have a responsibility to those families who are still searching for answers to put in place a system that will help them to get those answers, including in cases that he has mentioned, I would simply point out to him that it is estimated that between 25 and 35,000 paramilitaries served sentences of imprisonment during the Trouble for a wide variety of offences, including murder. And if he looks at the cases that are currently awaiting trial, he will find that most of them relate to former paramilitaries and not to our armed forces.
Jane Kirkham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's remarks in his statement about the professionalism, bravery and sacrifice of our armed forces and the role they played in Northern Ireland and across the UK. What discussions has he had with veterans, as well as the Defence Secretary and Veterans Minister, about the new protection in the Troubles Bill? And would the Secretary of State or one of the Defence Ministers be prepared to speak to veterans in Cornwall on this matter?
Well, I'm sure that my honourable friends who are ministers in the Ministry of Defence will have heard what my honourable friend has to say. The protections that have been brought before the House in the legislation are the result of extensive discussions with the Secretary of State for Defence, with the Armed Forces Ministers and with veterans' organisations.
Sir David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The front bench has quite rightly referred to the pain of the relatives of those who died on Bloody Sunday, and we all share in their sympathy in that. But nothing justifies the persecution of innocent people, innocent veterans in particular. The judge in the trial said the evidence presented by the Crown falls well short of the high standard of proof required in criminal cases. Well short. Yet, nevertheless, in 2 weeks' time there'll be another case of another soldier from 53 years ago, which has already been reviewed for 4 years by the DPP and ruled as no case to answer. Despite that, which has no evidence whatsoever since then, that man is being put through misery and persecution now. A 78-year-old man sitting in anxiety in his home, waiting for prosecution for a case that should never be brought. Does the Secretary of State not recognise that this is injustice? Injustice wrapped up however he likes it, it's injustice. And his legislation will mean many more such cases will occur.
Well, I would say to the right honourable gentleman that the legislation that the government has put before the House will make no change at all to the basis on which decisions about any potential prosecutions are made. None. Indeed, that system will remain as it has done right the way through the course of the Troubles and in the 27.5 years since. It is the case. Decisions about prosecutions are taken independently by prosecutors, and it is not for us to gainsay the decisions that those prosecutors take, because it is the absolute bedrock of our independent judicial system.
Mr. Speaker, some 250,000 people served in Operation Banner, and the vast majority did so with great distinction and huge bravery, leading to the peace that we see in Northern Ireland today. When it comes to prosecutions of Army veterans, the numbers are vanishingly small. So will the Secretary of State join me in thanking those veterans for their service and condemn the rhetoric that at times is coming out of the Conservative benches, which is unnecessarily stoking fear amongst those veterans?
Well, I have already expressed the thanks of the government in my answer to the honourable gentleman's question, and I think those sentiments are felt right across the House.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the clear and just verdict delivered by Justice Lynch, which rightly found Soldier F not guilty on all charges. Vindication for a man who served his country with honour and distinction. Does the Secretary of State agree that this case again exposes the disgrace of vexatious prosecutions of aged veterans pursued where there was never even evidence capable of meeting the threshold for conviction, and that it is time to end the witch hunt once and for all? And will he further agree that around 90% of all deaths during the Troubles were caused by terrorists? Of the 10% that involved the security forces, the largest percentage of these were engaging terrorists in murderous and criminal activities, and therefore Sinn Féin's historical revisionism, exemplified by the First Minister's comments post-verdict, were defamatory, and they They equated to the murders with those who defended democracy. Sorry, my apologies. Seeks to equate murders with those who defended democracy is an attempt to smear our veterans and shouldn't be allowed.
Well, I would say to the honourable member that I agree with her that 90% of those who were killed during the Troubles were killed by paramilitary terrorists, which is why the vast, vast majority of those who have been prosecuted and convicted have been paramilitary terrorists. But I do not agree with her when she uses the phrase vexatious prosecutions. There are no vexatious prosecutions. There are no vexatious prosecutions, because if the honourable member argues that a prosecution decision is vexatious, then she is criticising the independent prosecuting authorities in taking their decision on the basis of, is there a reasonable prospect of a conviction? Is it in the public interest to prosecute? And we should be extremely careful about trying to undermine an independent judicial system.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many IRA murders on UK soil have never been solved. They include the targeting of soldiers and their families in the M62 coach bombing in 1974 and the Warren Point massacre in 1979, the deadliest attack on the British Army during the Troubles. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that by shutting down investigations, including into the deaths of more than 200 Operation Banner soldiers, without an adequate alternative, the Legacy Act failed many families and victims of the Troubles?
I share my honourable friend's concern that she expressed about what happened as a result of the Legacy Act, but I do welcome the fact that in two of the cases she mentioned, the M62 coach bombing and Warren Point, they are now currently being investigated by the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, because members of their families have chosen to refer those cases. I welcome that. I want more families to have more confidence in the Commission, which is why I am seeking to reform it, so that they too feel able to refer their cases in.
Sir Bernard.
Can I say I'm listening very carefully to the Right Honourable Gentleman, that the whole premise of his case is that it is somehow in the public interest for people in that community to carry on trying to find people to blame and prosecute on both sides of the argument. But isn't the real case here, not only is it an extraordinary injustice for people to be prosecuted for having done their duty as members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, but that it doesn't serve the interests of peace and reconciliation to allow people and encourage people to carry on reopening the wounds when so much time and money has already been spent on trying to explain to people what happened to their loved ones. Nothing must detract from that sympathy, but it is a monstrous injustice that people in the line of duty who bear the scars of that conflict are paying the price for this almost politically correct process instead of drawing a line.
Well, I would gently say, to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I do not accept that characterisation he used at the end of his question. This is not a politically correct process. This is about trying to find a way forward for those families. Now, the honest answer to the fair point that he raises is that each family deals with the loss of their loved one in their own way. Some do not come forward, they live with their grief silently, alone. Others have campaigned. If it hadn't been for the campaigning of the Bloody Sunday families, there would not have been a Savile inquiry. We would not have got to the point where the former Prime Minister stood at this dispatch box to apologise for the killing of their loved ones. Having said that, in a vast majority of cases, no one is likely to be held to account through a judicial process. And that is why one of the focuses of the new commission will be on the fact-finding, the new body for information retrieval, to use all of the means at our disposal to try and provide answers to those families, and then it will be for them to decide how they come to terms with what happened. But we owe it to them to leave no stone unturned to put a system in place.
Sir Ian Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, as someone who served in Northern Ireland, I can just try and remind the House that this was the most peculiar operation that you would ever expect soldiers to do, to patrol streets in this United Kingdom, to defend people against terrorists here in the UK, against a very strict rules of engagement booklet, which made them, at a split-second decision, to have to make really complex decisions, and some of these are 18 years old, on the streets, petrified. So in that context, I simply say to the right honourable gentleman, he talks of equivalence, but over 700 British soldiers in Northern Ireland were killed by paramilitaries. Yep. Not one single paramilitary has been arraigned and taken to court for any of those murders that they conducted against the British Army and the British forces. I simply say to him, he talks of equivalence, but this is not equivalence, because it is those soldiers who will be persecuted for the rest of time, and not one single member of the paramilitaries who kept no records will ever go in front of a court. That's not fair.
Well, I would say to the right honourable gentleman, and I apologise if I've got this wrong, I don't remember using the word equivalence in what I had to say. What I said is that independent prosecutors will take decisions on the basis of the evidence they have before them. The current Legacy Commission is able to refer cases for potential prosecution. The new Legacy Commission will be able to do the same. And if there is evidence that will allow paramilitaries to be prosecuted, then it will be for the prosecutors to decide whether to bring a case. And if the right honourable gentleman cares to look at the convictions there have been since the Good Friday Agreement, most of them have related to paramilitaries. And as I said to the House a moment ago, most of the trials that are currently waiting to take place relate not to the armed forces but to paramilitaries.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State not understand, given the judge's comments that the evidence fell well short of the standard required, that actually veterans do consider that that was a vexatious prosecution? Yeah. They do consider that Soldier B is a vexatious prosecution, and they do feel utterly betrayed by this government repealing the Legacy Act.
Yeah. On the last point the honourable gentleman raises, the Legacy Act offered a false promise of immunity. That's what it did. It was found to be incompatible with our obligations. It had no support in Northern Ireland. At some point, those on that side of the House need to recognise it had no support in Northern Ireland. How can Northern Ireland move forward if the basis of the last government's legislation lacks that support? And in those circumstances, it is for prosecutors to take decisions. And we need to respect that. People may agree or disagree, but we need to respect the system in which prosecution decisions are taken independently, because there are other countries in the world where that is not the case.
Julius.
Any Secretary of State envisage any circumstances under which an IRA terrorist could be prosecuted after he has received a letter of comfort? And if so, what are those circumstances?
Well, I would cite to him the case of Mr. John Downey, as I've referred to in the House before. He received one of those letters, and as a result of having received it, his trial for the Hyde Park bombings was halted by the judge. But the public record will show, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Downey is currently awaiting trial for 2 murders during the Troubles, in which case the letter he received cannot be said to have granted him immunity from prosecution.
Jim Allister.
Speaker, I greatly welcome the not guilty verdict on Soldier F. But has the Secretary of State no empathy with Soldier F, a man who was put through years of turmoil and torture, awaiting prosecution, in circumstances where it was patently obvious that the evidence was never going to stack up? Yeah. As a lawyer, I'm absolutely astounded that this prosecution got as far as it did, because it relied entirely, in terms of what was relevant, on the word of two individuals, both of whom by then had been depicted as liars and perjurers, and neither of whom could be cross-examined. And yet our so-called independent prosecution service persisted with this prosecution. Is that not the very essence of what is vexatious? And going forward, does the Secretary of State agree that those who campaigned for this persecution of Soldier F should accept the verdict that he is not guilty and leave the man to live out his years in peace?
Well, it is a fundamental principle of our legal system that we accept the verdict of the courts, even if we may not agree with them. The honourable gentleman is a distinguished lawyer, and he expresses his views about the basis of that prosecution. The only point that I am making is that decision is made by independent prosecutors and not by any of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And 51 years ago this month, 21 people were murdered and 200 people injured in the Birmingham pub bombings. And last week, the Security Minister issued a statement saying that he would not be recommending a public inquiry, that instead the Justice for 21 could pursue justice via the Commission for Reconciliation that the Secretary of State's referred to. But BBC Northern Ireland are reporting that actually, because there has been an inquest into these bombings, that it would not be in scope for the Commission to look into the Birmingham pub bombings. So could the Secretary of State at the dispatch box confirm to the families Justice for 21 that it would indeed be possible for the Commission to look into it?
Secretary of State.
It would indeed be possible for them to refer the case into the Commission.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State, I first of all declare an interest as I served in the Ulster Defence Regiment and also Royal Artillery for some 14 and a half years. The ruling was expected as there was no additional evidence that Price held to be not fit for prosecution, and others have referred to that. It seems to me hard to understand how you pursue something when you don't have the criminal investigation and the evidence sorted in advance. It is clear that the Secretary of State must address the way forward and provide certainty for those service personnel who know they served honourably in impossible conditions, yet they live with the sort of Damocles hanging over their head, waiting to have their service used as a tool by Republicans to make it seem they were fighting a dirty war when quite clearly they weren't. So will the Secretary of State send a message today that the Secretary of State will not sign off of the narrative that our troops, the RUC and the Ulster Defence Regiment, were ever anything other than honourable men and women putting their lives on the line for us, and that they will be protected as honourably as they protected us? And how does the Secretary of State intend to protect them better than what we're doing right now?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware of the protections that we have put in the legislation following the discussions I referred to earlier that we've had with veterans, and I join him again in paying tribute to the extraordinarily brave service of all those who served during the time of Operation Banner in trying to protect the people of Northern Ireland from the terrorists. I would make the point that I know the whole House would agree with. When some people argue there was no alternative to that terrorism, there was. And we saw it in the signing of the Good Friday Agreement and what happened thereafter. There was always an alternative, and that is why we should always support those who did their duty honourably.
Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State balked at the word equivalence, so I have a go with another one. Does he believe that Northern Ireland terrorists should be treated equally in the same way as Northern Ireland veterans? And if he does, why doesn't he issue letters of comfort to the Northern Ireland veterans?
Secretary of State.
Well, the origin of the letters of comfort, or on-the-run letters, however one wishes to describe them, arose out of the time after the Good Friday Agreement, and the honourable gentleman will be well aware of that. But they did not, as I explained in answer to the right honourable gentleman's question a moment ago, they did not give anyone immunity from prosecution. And that is an extremely important point to make. And anyone who gives the impression that it gave immunity from prosecution is, I'm afraid, causing people unnecessary worry when the facts don't support it.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we move to Remembrance Sunday, many of those who served in Operation Banner will reflect on comrades that they lost, comrades who were injured, and comrades who still suffer mentally in regards to the operation that they were deployed on, the British Army's longest continuous deployment. The Secretary of State from the dispatch box has said his Troubles Bill will bring strong protections for veterans. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't. It brings the same protections for everyone under that bill, including those who possibly perpetrated those murderous acts of terrorism in Northern Ireland. So what can the Secretary of State actually provide in regards to the continuous support for veterans, rather than something that actually isn't in the legislation but is promised by government, rather than is actually in the face of the bill?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that the protections were put in place for veterans after consulting veterans, and they are not unimportant. The ability to stay at home and to give evidence, the protection from repeated investigations, the right to seek immunity in a hearing of the Commission. You have the right to seek that in a coroner's court. There are, of course, the two protections: protection from cold calling, and also the right to be heard through the statutory advisory group that will be established working alongside the Commission, which will have representation from a member of the armed forces or a police force. And those are very practical changes we've made, which, as I said earlier, were not contained in the current Legacy Act.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is right to say that this Remembrance Month underlines the debt of gratitude that we owe to those who serve our nation, but many in my constituency feel that that stands in stark contrast to the fundamental failure in our nation's duty of care to veterans of Operation Banner. The Secretary of State suggests that the Troubles Legacy Bill won't increase the risk of veterans being dragged through the courts, but veterans feel the reality is different. In the letter that my honourable friend referred to, they call it lawfare. They say that there's a legal conveyor belt of civil actions that are taking place. Isn't it time for a time limit on the civil actions related to historic military operations?
Well, the honourable member raises an important point. It is, however, very important to distinguish, as I know she will, between potential criminal prosecutions, which are the result of decisions of independent prosecutors, and civil cases. I mean, one of the other things that the courts found was that the ban on civil cases was incompatible with our human rights obligations. And I would point out that there has already been a civil case in relation to a paramilitary which found against that individual. And it is a fundamental feature of our system that people are able to bring civil cases. Decisions about how those cases are disposed of is rightly a matter for the courts.
My thoughts today are with the families of the Bloody Sunday victims and with the people of Derry who have carried the burden of grief, truth and justice for more than 5 decades. What happened on Bloody Sunday is not up for debate. The Savile inquiry established in painstaking detail what the Parachute Regiment did to peaceful civil rights demonstrators on the Bog side. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State explain how it was determined and who determined that Soldier F qualified for Ministry of Defence funding and what precedent this decision was based on, particularly given reports that he received double the financial support typically afforded to a single defendant? If he was eligible for legal aid, that avenue was open for him. Instead, £4.3 million of public money was spent defending a man who, in his own evidence to the Southern Inquiry, admitted his lethal role in the state-sanctioned murders on Bloody Sunday. Does the Secretary of State believe that this represents an equal and impartial application of justice, or a two-tiered system designed to shield the British state from accountability?
Well, I would say to the honourable member that the Savile inquiry report made very, very sobering and distressing reading for all of us. And like many members here, I was in the House to hear the former Prime Minister Lord Cameron make that apology to the family, something they'd campaigned for years and years and years when justice was denied them. And I will always remember the photographs of the fish that came out of the window in the Guildhall in Derry, Londonderry, as they heard what the Prime Minister at the time had sent from this dispatch box. On the first point that she raises, it is right and proper that the Ministry of Defence provides support to any veteran who is facing a criminal justice process. I think we would expect nothing less.
John Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's important that we in this House remember that terrorists killed members of this House, including Airy Neve, only a few hundred yards from where we stand today. The Secretary of State on previous occasions has indicated that something like 9 inquests could now restart. He has said that Loughgall, an exemplary special forces operation in which brave men stood up against terrorists and nullified them, will be one of those. He has not said which other 8 will be reopened. Can he take the opportunity to do that here today?
Very good. Well, I will do so when we have been able to inform the families in those cases. I hope the honourable gentleman would accept that it's only right and proper that we inform the families first, and then I will make a list available on the reason for the Loughgall inquest. As he will be aware, the former Attorney General on the 23rd of September 2015 said, and I quote, "Following careful consideration of a huge amount of material, I have come to the decision that new inquests into the Loughgall deaths are justified."
Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State tell the House how it is compatible with the sovereignty of the United Kingdom to give the Irish government an official role, effectively a veto, over the new framework that the government proposes? And is he confident that the Irish state itself will do everything it can to ensure that its agents are held to account for any collusion that may have happened in atrocities carried out by Irish nationalists during the Troubles?
The Irish government does not have a veto. I stood next to the Taoiseach, Simon Harris, and I made commitments on behalf of the British government, and he made commitments on behalf of the Irish government. And all of us in the House who wish families to get answers that they've been searching for so long should welcome the fact that the Irish government is prepared to move from where they are now, because they oppose the Legacy Act to a place where they will give it the fullest cooperation, and in the course of that, we all hope to provide more information, to give more families answers. That is what we are trying to do, and I hope the honourable gentleman will welcome the fact that the two governments are working together on this, because it will help families.
Right, we'll let the front benches change over. Point of order, it is to this, yes. Sir David.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State, during the course of his responses today, has said two things. On the one hand, he has said letters of comfort do not give immunity. And on the other hand, he accepted that letters of comfort stopped the prosecution of Mr. Downey in the Hyde Park bombing. It seems to me these two statements are inconsistent. What is available to him to correct Hansard to make one of them put right?
Secretary of State.
What I said was indeed absolutely accurate, as the right honourable gentleman well knows. The circumstances of the trial of Mr. Downey in relation to the Hyde Park bombing, the reason why the judge called that to a halt was set out, but subsequent statements made it quite clear that those letters of comfort did not constitute immunity, as the subsequent events, not least the impending prosecution of Mr. Downey, demonstrates.